Once again, inaction in Congress leads us to a new ruling which will replace the legislative process of the common people with the preferences of the few on the Supreme Court. This is no way to write law. This is no way to write internet policy. Every member of Congress over the past 40 years should feel shame that they have so neglected their duties that lawsuits have become our legislative process. Congress doesn't solve anything, so we take people to court. Hello again and welcome to the country. My name is Justin Weller. Thanks so much for joining us. As always, you can catch the latest columns and pods at thecountry.news. Go ahead and become a subscriber there. You'll get access to the entire archive and ad-free videos of this show. You can also find us on the X at JWTheCountry. And we're also on Rumble and YouTube. The show's called The Country with Justin Weller. Go ahead and check us out. Give us a follow if you would. It's an exciting time to be a space enthusiast. After the amazing highs of the space race of the 1960s and the moon landings in the early 1970s, the exploration of space has been a sad afterthought in the American conversation. The space shuttle was interesting, but it never went anywhere we hadn't already been. And it eventually became very tired and, quite frankly, cost inefficient that the entire enterprise was scrapped by President Bush in 2014. The last shuttle flight was in 2011. Since then, NASA has depended on the Russian space program and more recently SpaceX and other private companies to accomplish much of their progress. But that move, encouraging commercial enterprise in space as the subsequently slashed NASA budget could not afford much, turned out to be a force multiplier. Companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, and Intuitive Machines, which we're watching here, the company that just landed the Odysseus lunar lander on the moon, which is the first successful such mission to the moon by any entity in the United States in more than 50 years. These companies sprang up to begin a new space revolution. SpaceX, run by Elon Musk, has been the commercial partner of NASA, the Department of Defense, and many others, launching 4 times as many satellites as the rest of the world combined. SpaceX launched the Odysseus lander on their rocket, will be the next rocket that powers the next mission to the moon with NASA and astronauts, and is working itself towards an historic manned mission to Mars. That will be so cool to see. I think Mr. Musk has said that it's going to be sometime this decade, like mid-decade. So maybe in just a few years. Blue Origin, the darling of Jeff Bezos, has had a slower start to its space endeavors, but has successfully launched a manned mission into space. And according to Mr. Bezos on the Lex Fridman podcast, is focusing on building efficiencies in moving materials into orbit, a necessary step for the next generation of space stations, space hotels, and other infrastructure to explore the solar system. These plans could include a deep space space station, right? That would make it easier to reach Mars and eventually other planets. Think of it like a sort of a refueling, resting place somewhere on the way. The first, interplanetary gas station, if you will. Virgin Galactic seems to be the furthest behind, mostly focusing on near-Earth space tourism. But hey, any of it helps, and it's cool. One of the exciting things about the development of these companies is that they are building the infrastructure for which space exploration, space experiments, space mining, and other future businesses will be able to take advantage. As Mr. Bezos related in that same Lex Fridman podcast, I highly recommend it. Go listen to it. Mr. Bezos likens it to the beginning of the internet and startup technology firms. Before companies like Amazon, Facebook, or Google could be started in a garage by a few techies, the building blocks of the internet were created first by the Department of Defense and then large commercial enterprises that built the infrastructure to connect the world. Bezos hopes that SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others will likewise build an infrastructure that enables the next generation of space technologists to have low barriers of entry to create the space enterprises of the 22nd century. As a proud American and a space enthusiast, it is a great time to be alive and watch our fellow humans tackle the next frontier, perhaps the greatest challenges we will ever attempt. Next, is there a person in that egg? A controversial ruling in Alabama this past week provided just the fodder needed to motivate pro-choice advocates in the fall election. In a majority opinion, the state Supreme Court of Alabama ruled that parents whose frozen fertilized embryos were destroyed, particular parents, they sued, through the alleged negligence at the Mobile hospital where the embryos were stored, could sue the hospital for wrongful death of a minor. Okay, very narrow case. The court cited a 2018 amendment, however, to the Alabama Constitution. That amendment passed with 61% of the vote that states, quote, to declare and otherwise affirm that it is the public policy of the state to recognize and support the sanctity of unborn life and the rights of unborn children, and to provide that the Constitution of this state does not protect the right to abortion or require the funding of abortion, end quote. The court found that this language makes no exclusion for what they called extrauterine unborn children, and thus the suit by the parents of these fertilized embryos could move forward. To this observer, the ruling seems very narrow in scope, perhaps based upon awkward language in the amendment that led to some unintended consequences. Indeed, most Republicans have come out against this ruling. Most of the subsequent controversy and concern seems to be centered around the speculation about how this one, as I'm saying, narrow ruling, which in my opinion could be overturned, will affect other rulings in the future. You know, the idea is, well, basically some of these Alabama IVF, these fertilization companies, are stopping the process because they don't want to get sued if they accidentally destroy the eggs. So something needs to be done, right? But it's once again terrible timing for Republicans, just like the Dobbs decisions of 2022. More on that in a moment. That may swing and otherwise change election back to Democrats. Every poll that anybody has ever seen has seen in Congress, Republicans are +4, +5. President Trump is leading in every swing state. He's leading in the national polls. You know, everybody's sort of baking in that he's going to win. But something like this can swing it back. It did in 2022. Remember, there was going to be a big red wave, and then it crashed. And the reason it crashed was Dobbs. Single females in suburbia, mostly, coming out to protect their abortion rights. So it's going to happen again. They're going to hammer Republicans on abortion until the sun doesn't shine. If Republicans had any sense, they would support a compromise, common sense abortion ban at, you pick it, 25 weeks, 20 weeks, 26 weeks. And take this issue off the table. But they won't. And it may mean 4 more years of President Biden. And it may mean a Democratic Speaker of the House in 2025. CBS News, are they an arm of the deep state? Last week, they were under serious pressure if they not only fired Catherine Herridge, but allegedly seized all of her files, computers, and notes. Ms. Herridge has been recognized for years as one of the few investigative reporters left in the big corporate media who chases down important stories and breaks them, regardless of their political implications. The most chilling part of the seizure and the firing is that Ms. Herridge was reportedly working on the Biden family corruption case at the time of her firing. She is indeed under indictment and threatened with contempt of court to reveal sources in her investigation. And the firing and the seizure of her notes is unprecedented. It certainly smells of deep state corruption, forcing CBS to break the law in the First Amendment. I hope someday soon the rest of corporate media will wake up to the sad state of their news organizations. They are being reduced to mouthpieces of the Democratic Party and parts of the intelligence community that seem to like to run psyops in the American electorate. Well, it's election season again. So the Russians are coming. And the never-ending silliness that is the Russian moral panic, now 8 years on, and that Trump likes to summarize as Russia, Russia, Russia. Sorry, that's a bad impression. I'll work on it. The narrative writers in Washington have trotted out the old Russian disinformation line to describe the entire case of the Biden family corruption. It seems that one witness, identified in reporting as Alexander Smirnov, can't make this up, he's a vodka guy, I guess, has been indicted and arrested for lying to the FBI. Smirnov has been a trusted FBI informant for years, for 10 years at least, and used for many different cases. But suddenly, He is no longer trusted due to his admitting freely that he has had contacts with Russian intelligence. David Weiss, the special prosecutor assigned to the Hunter Biden case, who IRS whistleblowers accused of covering up the investigation, who disallowed investigation into leads linking Joe Biden, or the big guy, to the corruption, who also slow-walked charges past the statute of limitations, who also offered such a stunningly sweetheart plea deal to Hunter Biden that the judge threw it out within minutes, is the prosecutor who has accused Smirnov. Once again, our entire political engine is embroiled in a Russian panic that most closely resembles the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798. All we need to do is switch out France and Russia. It is amazing that whenever Democrats are caught up in mischief, the old Russia card is played to media fanfare. It must really drive clicks and eyeballs. The arrest of Smirnov and the charges seem a little unorthodox. He was arrested, freed by a judge, and then rearrested. And the need to have Smirnov's testimony. He testified that the Bidens received $10 million in a secret bribe from Burisma in order to find the Bidens guilty has been completely misconstrued and is being used by partisans, especially Heather Cox Richardson, who writes the that daily Substack, Letters from America. She's using it, and many others, to pretend that the entire case rests on Smirnov's FD 1023, and thus, somehow, Russian intelligence. The truth is, we can erase completely Mr. Smirnov's testimony and his claims, and the facts of the case against Joe Biden are unchanged. As Jonathan Turley wrote in the New York Post, in relation to the influence peddling investigation, this filing does not change the evidence that the Biden family made millions in shaking down foreign companies and businesses in exchange for influence. Of course. Hunter received millions from Burisma. He received millions from a Chinese energy company and AmeriCorps, among others, without Smirnov's $10 million Burisma bribe. And we seem to constantly forget when it supports our conclusions that indictments are not findings of guilt. It's a great way to freeze out testimony, to change the narrative to, this is, again, just Russian disinformation. Just call a guy that you've paid to be an informant for 10 years, suddenly a liar that's suborning Russian intelligence and perjury, right? It's an easy way to change the whole narrative. And that's all they care about. But let's remember, the prosecutor needs to prove his case before we dismiss Smirnov's FD 1023. I wonder if Heather Cox Richardson has thought about that. There hasn't been a plea hearing yet in the case, even. Not even a plea hearing. The guy hasn't even pled guilty or innocent. Come on, Heather. Finally, to succinctly address the claim that the Biden impeachment case is over without Smirnov's testimony, watch Jim Jordan completely destroy CNN reporter Manu Raju, who wants to basically scream, but they're all lies. Let's go ahead and watch this.
Involvement in a bribery scheme now that Alexander Smirnov is proven to have made it up, and it was based off Russian intelligence.
Doesn't change the four fundamental facts. Hunter Biden was put on the board of Burisma, gets paid $1 million a year. Fact number two, he's not qualified to be on the board. He said so himself in an interview, I don't know, with you or some network. Fact number three, Zolochevsky and Pizarski, the two executives at Burisma, specifically asked Hunter Biden, can you weigh in with D.C. and help us deal with the pressure we are facing from the prosecutor? Fact number four, Joe Biden, then he gets called. Hunter Biden calls his dad, according to Devin Archer, Hunter Biden's business partner. Fact number four, Joe Biden then goes to Ukraine 3 days later and conditions the release of the money, American tax money, on the firing of the prosecutor who was applying the pressure to the company that Hunter Biden sat on the board of.
You said the 1023 is the most corroborating piece of information you have.
It corroborates, but it doesn't change those fundamental facts. So now
but it's not true.
Well, so okay, so the FBI told us that this source was so 14.
Yeah, it's pretty clear, pretty hard to argue. Anyway, moving on. We talked a little bit about judges before. I want to cover a little bit more. Judicial rulings have become an increasing part of the lives of common Americans. Look no further than abortion law, which now swings on the makeup of the Supreme Court. rather than the makeup of our legislative bodies and elected officials. That's who should be writing laws. The Supreme Court should just be determining which laws are constitutional and which are not. The recent Alabama IVF case that we just talked about sent shockwaves around the abortion advocate world. That really shouldn't be so. A functioning legislature at the state and federal level should be making these decisions, not a court. But our legislators have long abdicated their responsibility, and agents of political machines have brought prosecutions and civil suits to preferred activist judges. This happens on both sides of the aisle, to fill in the gaps to write preferred law through legal rather than the legislative process. It's really hard to get legislation passed. And in some ways, it's easier to win a court case. Just because it's easier doesn't make it right. This is not a good thing. Take, for example, the recent case of the Trump Organization in New York City. As a way of background, Letitia James, the New York District Attorney who brought down Governor Cuomo with a damning report on his sexual harassment allegations, but also in which no charges were filed, forced the governor to ultimately resign. Ms. James proceeded briefly to attempt to take Mr. Cuomo's place as governor. She dropped out of the governor's race due to low polling and ran instead for re-election to the Attorney General's office in 2022, promising that the next political figure she would target for prosecution, or was it persecution, I can't remember, was Donald Trump. She won that election with 54% of the vote, and off she went. She sued and won in the civil case, with the judge finding Trump and his organization were fraudulent in the production of financial statements to get real estate loans approved by their lender, Deutsche Bank. I should have said also that Ms. James filed those charges in September of 2022, just 60 days before her election. Do you think it's popular in New York if you're shown to be getting Trump? It's kind of bad. It's pretty bad. Amazingly, of course, did they have that case in 2022? Nope. The whole of 2023? Well, it started towards the end. And so it seems like just wonderful timing for election season, right? This case did not come to be heard until smack dab in the middle of the current presidential election. The judge, Engeron, who has had to respond to claims of his own bias against Mr. Trump, ruled in her favor this month, finding that Trump owes the government $450 million. It's a $350 million judgment and $100 million in interest at 9%, which nobody pays, for what most describe as normal business practices in real estate development. The judge has also barred Mr. Trump from managing or being an officer in any business in New York for 3 years. That ruling is simply ludicrous. As many have said, there is no victim in this alleged suit. The bank that loaned Trump the money based upon the evaluation of his assets approved those valuations, made money, he paid them all back with interest on time, and stated that they would gladly work with him again. And yet it's $450 million in fraud. The famous Shark Tank investor Kevin O'Leary said in a response, "This is awkward. I mean, just leaving the whole Trump thing out of it and seeing what occurred here. And I'm no different than any other investor. I'm shocked at this. I can't even understand or fathom the decision at all. There's no rationale for it." End quote. Florida Governor Jeb Bush and Palantir founder and tech investor Joe Lonsdale wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal just recently that said, if these rulings stand, the damage could cascade through the economy, creating fear of arbitrary enforcement against entrepreneurs who seek public office or raise their voices as citizens in a way that politicians dislike. End quote. That's totalitarianism personified. It is chilling. In another case, Elon Musk's compensation from Tesla, it was a package that was agreed to by 80% of the shareholders more than 5 years ago, was determined recently in a Delaware court to be too rich, based upon a suit brought by a person who only owned 9 shares of Tesla. That's where it was worth about $200 when he bought it. Oh, and by the way, when he sold it, it was worth $2,000. By all accounts, the incentive pay for Mr. Musk was designed to be nigh impossible to achieve. And Musk's achievement were very well rewarded to the tune of $56 billion. I personally am a shareholder of Tesla. I bought it back over that period. We made amazing returns that I doubt any other person could have achieved at the helm of the flagship company. I would gladly pay Mr. Musk another $56 billion to do it again. And so finally today, I think they've ended now, earlier today, where the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in two social media free speech cases. One is Moody versus Net Choice LLC, and the other is Net Choice LLC, the same entity, versus Paxton, and Moody being the Attorney General of Florida. Ken Paxton, is the Attorney General of Texas. So these involve laws passed in Florida and Texas that seek to limit the ability of social media platforms to remove politicians or other political speech from their websites. At issue is whether or not speech on a private company's products, say X or Facebook or whoever, is protected by the First Amendment or not. While it may be germane for the court to hear such a case, we are left asking Congress, why? Why? After years and years of blustering, grandstanding, and ceremonial beratings of social media executives, they've trotted them up for years. Jack Dorsey was up there for Twitter. Mark Zuckerberg has been multiple times, just recently had to stand up and apologize to everybody. We've seen this movie over and over and over and over again, but they haven't passed any legislation. They haven't updated the communication laws since the 70s. And it's now like Internet 3.0 practically. They've done nothing. Why haven't they yet protected speech on these platforms? These platforms have already been established by the Supreme Court as the public square. Go look at the case. It's Justice Kennedy. Actually, I forget the name of the case, but if you just Google Justice Kennedy, social media is the public square, you'll find it. He says it in a ruling. Once again, inaction in Congress leads us to a new ruling which will replace the legislative process of the common people with the preferences of the few on the Supreme Court. This is no way to write law. This is no way to write internet policy. Every member of Congress over the past 40 years should feel shame that they have so neglected their duties that lawsuits have become our legislative process. Congress doesn't solve anything. So we take people to court. And in fact, again, political actors know this, and they use it to manipulate courts and get what they want. Congress should take steps to redefine the obligations of social media companies in the 21st century and take strong steps to limit the ability of any private company to silence Americans, to firmly protect the speech of the common people. These are the fundamental first principles necessary to restoring a healthy, deliberative democracy. The Supreme Court should punt this case. They should basically just say, internet companies can't block speech. It's up to Congress to define what is and is not speech, and require they produce legislation immediately. Let's put this horse back in the barn. Well, that's the country. That's the country for today. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope you have a great day. See ya.